The morning fog hung heavy over London as Queen Elizabeth II stood before her bedroom mirror at Buckingham Palace. Her lady-in-waiting had already laid out the black dress, the one reserved for the saddest of occasions. Today was not just another funeral. Today, they would say goodbye to Patricia Knatchbull, the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, a woman who had been woven into the fabric of the royal family for decades. The Queen's hands trembled slightly as she fastened her pearl necklace. She was 91 years old, and with each passing year, the funerals seemed to come more frequently. But this one felt different. Patricia had not been just a distant relative or a courtier fulfilling duty. She had been a friend, a confidant, and a bridge between the old world and the new. Elizabeth thought back to her wedding day in 1947. Patricia had been there, young and vibrant, part of the celebration that marked the beginning of her own journey as a royal wife. Patricia understood the weight of duty, the sacrifice required, the loneliness that sometimes accompanied a life of service. They had shared something unspoken, a mutual understanding that came from living lives that were never entirely their own. The palace corridors were unusually quiet that morning. Staff members moved with hushed efficiency, their faces somber. Everyone knew what this day meant, not just for the Queen, but for the entire royal family. Patricia's death had sent ripples through their tight circle, reminding them all of their mortality and the passage of time. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was already dressed and waiting in the drawing room. At 96, he had become more reflective, less inclined to his famous sharp remarks. He sat in his favorite chair, staring out at the palace gardens, lost in his own memories. Patricia had been related to him through her father, Lord Mountbatten, who had been Philip's uncle and mentor. The loss was deeply personal. Across London, at Clarence House, Prince Charles was preparing for the day with a heavy heart. His valet had pressed his black suit to perfection, but Charles barely noticed. He stood by the window, watching the city wake up, completely unaware of the significant role he would play in the day's events. Patricia had been like a grandmother to him, though technically she was a second cousin once removed. Such technicalities meant nothing when it came to the bonds they had formed. She had been present at every major milestone of his life, offering wisdom when he needed it, comfort when he faltered, and unwavering support through his darkest times. Charles remembered the summers at Broadlands, Patricia's country estate. As a young boy, he had run through those gardens, chased butterflies, and learned to fish in the streams that ran through the property. Patricia had always made time for him, even when he was just one of many young royals demanding attention. She had a way of making each person feel seen, valued, and understood. The relationship between Charles and his mother had never been simple. The Queen was duty personified, raised to put the crown before everything else, including her own children. Charles had grown up with a mother who was always just out of reach, always belonging more to the nation than to him. It had created a distance between them, a gap filled with formality and unspoken emotions. But Patricia had helped bridge that gap in small ways. She had often spoken to Charles about his mother, helping him understand the impossible position Elizabeth had been thrust into at just 25 years old. Patricia had witnessed the Queen's coronation, seen the young woman disappear behind the crown, and understood the cost of such transformation. The drive to St. Paul's Cathedral was solemn. The Queen sat in her state car, her face carefully composed, revealing nothing of the grief she felt inside. This was what she had been trained to do since childhood: show no weakness, display no excessive emotion, be the rock upon which the nation could steady itself. But inside, Elizabeth was remembering. She was remembering Patricia's laugh, bright and unexpected. She was remembering late-night conversations at Balmoral, when the rest of the house had gone to bed, and they could speak freely about the challenges of their unique lives. She was remembering the way Patricia had held her hand when Philip had been hospitalized, offering silent support when words felt inadequate. Patricia's life had been marked by both privilege and profound tragedy. In 1979, the IRA had planted a bomb on her father's fishing boat. The explosion had killed Lord Mountbatten, Patricia's 14-year-old son Nicholas, her mother-in-law, and a local boy who had been helping on the boat. Patricia herself had been severely injured, pulled from the water with devastating injuries that should have killed her. But she had survived. More than that, she had found the strength to forgive, to continue living with grace and purpose. She had never let bitterness consume her, never allowed the violence that shattered her family to define her remaining years. The Queen had watched this transformation with awe and deep respect. Charles arrived at the cathedral before his mother, as protocol demanded. He stood with other family members in the cold morning air, his breath visible in small clouds. His sons, William and Harry, stood nearby, both understanding the significance of the day. They too had known Patricia, had benefited from her wisdom and warmth. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was heavy with grief and memory. Flowers adorned every surface, white lilies that filled the air with their sweet, cloying scent. The guest list read like a who's who of British aristocracy, military leaders, and those who had been touched by Patricia's remarkable life. But beneath the grandeur was genuine sorrow. These people had not come out of duty alone. They had come to mourn someone they truly loved. When the Queen's car pulled up to the cathedral entrance, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. This was always the moment of highest tension at royal events, the moment when all eyes turned to Elizabeth. She emerged from the car with the assistance of her staff, her movements careful but dignified. The years had taken their toll on her body, but her bearing remained regal. Charles watched his mother approach, and his heart clenched. He saw something in her face that others might miss, a tightness around her eyes, a set to her jaw that spoke of emotions held firmly in check. He knew his mother well enough to recognize when she was struggling, even if she would never admit it. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Hymns that Patricia had chosen herself filled the cathedral with sound that seemed to reach up to the heavens. Readings were delivered by family members, their voices cracking with emotion, but pushing through with determination. The eulogy painted a picture of a woman who had lived fully, loved deeply, and given generously of herself to everyone she encountered. Throughout the service, the Queen sat with perfect posture, her face a mask of composure. She sang the hymns in her clear, steady voice. She bowed her head during prayers. She listened to the stories of Patricia's life with apparent calm. But Charles, sitting nearby, could sense the strain. He could see the slight tremor in her gloved hands, the way she gripped her handbag just a little too tightly. The loss of Patricia represented more than just the death of a friend. It was another thread cut from the tapestry of the Queen's long life, another connection to her youth severed. The generation that had surrounded her in her early years as monarch was disappearing, leaving her increasingly alone in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Patricia had been one of the last people who remembered Elizabeth before she became the Queen, who had known her as a young woman full of hopes and dreams before duty reshaped her into an icon. With Patricia's death, that link to her younger self had been broken. The weight of that loss pressed down on Elizabeth's shoulders like a physical burden. As the service drew to a close, the congregation prepared for the final farewell. The pallbearers, including Patricia's sons, lifted the coffin with practiced care. The organ began to play, filling the cathedral with music that was both triumphant and sorrowful. The royal family rose to their feet, preparing to follow the coffin out of the cathedral. It was in this moment, as the Queen stood and gathered herself for the walk out, that Charles made a decision. It was not planned. It was not something they had discussed. It was simply something he knew he needed to do. His mother, who had stood strong for so long, who had carried the weight of the crown with such grace for over 6 decades, needed to know she was not alone in her grief. The world would remember what happened next as a small gesture, a brief moment captured by cameras and broadcast around the globe. But for Charles and his mother, it would mean so much more. It would represent a shift in their relationship, a moment of genuine connection in a life that had too few of them. It would be a son reaching out to his mother, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. The cathedral doors opened, letting in the pale London light. The moment was approaching, the moment that would be photographed, analyzed, and remembered. But neither Charles nor the Queen knew that yet. They were simply two people, bound by blood and duty, preparing to face grief together in a way they never had before. The procession began to move slowly down the cathedral aisle. The Queen walked with measured steps, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her, Charles followed, his mind racing with thoughts of his mother, of Patricia, of the fragility of life, and the certainty of loss. Outside the cathedral, photographers and camera crews jostled for position. They had been stationed there since before dawn, waiting for this moment. Royal funerals always drew media attention, but there was something about this particular event that felt significant. Perhaps it was the Queen's age. Perhaps it was the emotional weight of losing someone so close to the family. Whatever the reason, the world was watching. The Queen emerged into the daylight, and for just a fraction of a second, Charles saw her falter. It was barely noticeable, just a slight hesitation in her step, a momentary break in her usual steady rhythm. But it was enough. In that instant, Charles understood that his mother was not the invincible figure the world believed her to be. She was a 91-year-old woman who had just said goodbye to a dear friend, and she was hurting. Without thinking, without calculating the implications or considering the protocols, Charles stepped forward. His hand reached out, gently touching his mother's arm, a gesture of support and solidarity. The Queen glanced at him, and in her eyes he saw something he rarely witnessed: vulnerability. The photographers' cameras began clicking frantically. They had captured something, though they did not yet know its full significance. A prince touching his mother's arm at a funeral was not unusual in itself, but there was something in the way Charles looked at the Queen, something in the tenderness of the gesture, that made it noteworthy. The royal party made their way to the waiting cars. The wind had picked up, sending fallen leaves skittering across the cathedral steps. The Queen pulled her coat tighter around herself, and again Charles was there, his presence a shield against the cold and the grief. Inside the car that would take them to the reception, the Queen and Charles sat in silence for several moments. Outside, London passed by in a blur of gray buildings and curious faces pressed against barriers. Inside, mother and son existed in a bubble of shared sorrow. Finally, the Queen spoke. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, so unlike her usual crisp, authoritative tone. She talked about Patricia, about the early days when they were both young women navigating the complicated world of royal life. She spoke of Patricia's resilience after the bombing, of her courage in facing each day when it would have been easier to give up. Charles listened, really listened, in a way he perhaps had not done in years. He heard not just his mother's words, but the emotion behind them. He understood, perhaps for the first time, just how lonely her position had been. The Queen could not show weakness to her staff, could not break down in front of the public, could not even fully confide in her husband about certain matters. She had to be strong, always strong, and that strength had cost her dearly. The reception was held at a private club in Mayfair, a place that had hosted generations of aristocrats and royals. The rooms were filled with people sharing memories, comforting one another, celebrating Patricia's life, even as they mourned her death. Waiters moved silently through the crowd with trays of tea and small sandwiches, maintaining the veneer of civilization even in grief. The Queen moved through the reception with practiced grace, speaking to Patricia's children, offering condolences to extended family members, thanking those who had come to pay their respects. She was once again the monarch, the figurehead, the symbol of stability and continuity. But Charles stayed close, always within reach, a silent guardian watching over his mother. People noticed. Of course they noticed. In the intricate world of royal watching, even the smallest gestures were examined for meaning. The fact that Prince Charles was hovering near his mother, that he seemed unusually attentive and protective, did not go unnoticed. Whispers began to circulate. Was the Queen unwell? Was there some family crisis brewing? Or was this simply a son caring for his aging mother? The truth was simpler and more profound than any of the speculation. Something had shifted between Charles and Elizabeth that day. The formal distance that had characterized their relationship for so many years had cracked, allowing genuine emotion to seep through. They were connecting not as monarch and heir, but as mother and son, two people united in grief. Lady Brabourne, one of Patricia's daughters, approached the Queen at one point during the reception. Her eyes were red from crying, but she maintained her composure as she spoke to Elizabeth. They talked quietly, their heads bent close together, sharing memories that only they could fully understand. Charles watched from a few feet away, giving them privacy, but remaining alert to his mother's needs. When Lady Brabourne finally moved away, the Queen stood alone for a moment, her shoulders sagging slightly when she thought no one was looking. But Charles was looking. He had been watching all day, attuned to every subtle sign of his mother's emotional state. He approached her again, this time offering his arm. The Queen took it, leaning on her son more than she had in decades. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. The mighty Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned for over 60 years, who had met with countless world leaders, who had been a symbol of strength and continuity through times of war and peace, was allowing herself to be vulnerable with her son. They walked together to a quieter corner of the reception room, away from the main crowd. Through the tall windows, they could see the London skyline, the mix of historic buildings and modern towers that represented the nation's past and future existing side by side. Charles spoke then, his voice low and earnest. He told his mother that he understood how difficult the day had been, that he recognized the depth of her loss. He reminded her that she did not have to be strong all the time, that it was okay to grieve, to feel the weight of sadness. He told her that he was there, that he would always be there, and that she could lean on him. The Queen listened, her eyes fixed on the cityscape beyond the window. When Charles finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly that he almost missed it, she thanked him. It was a simple word, but, coming from his mother, it carried the weight of years of unspoken emotion. As the reception continued, Charles made sure his mother ate something, that she had water, that she was not overwhelmed by well-wishers. He ran interference when he sensed she needed a break, stepping in to engage people in conversation and giving the Queen moments of respite. Prince William and Prince Harry watched their father's attentiveness with quiet approval. They too had been close to Patricia, and they understood the significance of what was happening. Their father, who had often seemed uncertain in his role, who had faced criticism and controversy throughout his life, was stepping up in a moment that truly mattered. He was being exactly what his mother needed him to be. Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, also observed her husband's behavior with a sense of pride and understanding. She had often encouraged Charles to bridge the gap with his mother, to find ways to connect beyond the formality of their roles. Today, grief had provided that bridge, and Charles was crossing it with grace and compassion. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd at the reception began to thin. People made their farewells, offering final condolences before returning to their own lives and their own griefs. The royal family would be among the last to leave, as protocol demanded, but even they would eventually have to face the drive back to their respective residences. Before they left, Charles did something unexpected. He asked his mother if she would like to visit Patricia's grave after the official burial ceremony the next day. It would be private, just the two of them, away from cameras and crowds and the weight of public expectation. They could say their own goodbye, in their own way, without the burden of representing anything or anyone beyond themselves. The Queen looked at her son with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. She accepted the invitation immediately, recognizing it for what it was, an offer of shared mourning, a chance to be simply human in the face of loss. That evening, as the Queen returned to Buckingham Palace, she felt different. The grief was still there, heavy and real, but it was accompanied by something else. She felt less alone. For so many years, she had carried her burdens in isolation, believing that was what duty required. But today, Charles had shown her another way. He had shown her that strength did not have to mean solitude, that accepting support did not diminish her dignity. In his own home that night, Charles reflected on the day. He thought about the moment when he had touched his mother's arm, when he had seen past the crown and the title to the person beneath. He thought about how fragile she had seemed, and how that fragility had made him want to protect her in a way he had never felt before. The relationship between a mother and son is complex under the best circumstances. When that mother is also a queen, and that son is destined to inherit her throne, the complexity multiplies exponentially. For decades, Charles and Elizabeth had navigated their relationship with formality and distance, never quite finding a way to bridge the gap between their public roles and their private connection. But grief, as it often does, had broken down barriers that protocol and habit had built over years. In Patricia's death, Charles and the Queen had found a way to connect authentically, to see each other not as monarch and heir, but as two people united by loss and by love. The photographs from the funeral would be published in newspapers around the world. Media commentators would analyze every gesture, every glance, every moment of interaction between the Queen and her son, but they would miss the most important part of the story. They would miss the shift that had occurred, the healing that had begun, the bridge that had been built between a mother and her son in a moment of shared vulnerability. The morning after the funeral dawned gray and misty, typical of English autumn weather. The Queen had slept poorly, her mind replaying memories of Patricia, moments spanning decades playing out in vivid detail behind her closed eyes. She had finally risen at dawn, forsaking the extra rest her doctors always encouraged, and found herself drawn to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The groundskeepers were already at work, maintaining the meticulous landscaping that had been a source of pride for generations of monarchs. Elizabeth watched them for a while, finding comfort in the continuity of their labor, in the way life continued even when it felt like the world should pause to acknowledge loss. Her breakfast arrived precisely at 8, as it always did. The routine was soothing in its predictability. Toast, tea, marmalade, and the morning papers carefully arranged by her staff. But today, the newspapers carried images from yesterday's funeral, and the Queen found herself staring at photographs of her own face, looking for the grief she had felt but tried to hide. One photograph caught her attention. It showed Charles's hand on her arm, his face turned toward her with an expression of concern and tenderness. The image captured something real, something genuine, and Elizabeth was surprised to find herself moved by it. She had not realized how much his presence had meant to her in that moment, until she saw it reflected back through the camera's lens. Across the city, Charles was also awake early, standing in his study at Clarence House. He had called his mother's private secretary the previous evening to confirm the details of their planned private visit to Patricia's grave. The secretary had been surprised by the request, but had arranged everything discreetly, as was his job. Charles understood that what he was proposing was unusual. The royal family did not often deviate from established protocols, and private, unscheduled visits were complicated to arrange from a security standpoint. But he felt strongly that his mother needed this, and more importantly, that he needed it too. They needed time to process their grief away from the public eye, away from the weight of expectation. The drive to the burial site was scheduled for late morning, after the official interment ceremony, but before the afternoon obligations that could not be postponed. Charles would collect his mother from the palace, and they would make the journey together in a single, unmarked vehicle with minimal security presence. When Charles arrived at Buckingham Palace, he found his mother waiting in a private sitting room, dressed in simple black clothes, without the formal attire or jewelry that usually accompanied her public appearances. She looked smaller somehow, more like any elderly woman than like a queen, and Charles felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. They walked together to the car, bypassing the grand entrance where photographers usually gathered. The staff members they passed nodded respectfully, but maintained their distance, understanding without being told that this was a private moment, something sacred and separate from the usual business of royalty. Inside the car, they sat in comfortable silence for the first part of the journey. The driver navigated through London traffic with practiced skill, heading toward the countryside where Patricia would be laid to rest near her father and the family members who had died in the bombing decades earlier. The Queen watched the city give way to suburbs, and then to green fields and ancient trees. The landscape was familiar, dotted with villages she had visited over her long reign, but today it felt different, as though she was seeing it through new eyes. Finally, she spoke. She told Charles about a conversation she had had with Patricia years ago, shortly after Philip's retirement from public duties. Patricia had asked her if she ever felt lonely, carrying the weight of the crown while those around her gradually stepped back from their own responsibilities. Elizabeth had not answered directly at the time, deflecting with humor as she often did when conversations became too personal. But now, in the safety of this private moment with her son, she admitted the truth. Yes, she felt lonely. Terribly, profoundly lonely. The crown that had given her purpose and identity had also isolated her in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. Patricia had understood, because she too had lived a life shaped by duty and expectation, by the weight of a famous name and the responsibilities that came with it. Charles listened without interrupting, recognizing the gift his mother was giving him. She rarely shared such personal reflections, rarely let anyone see beneath the carefully maintained facade. He wanted to absorb every word, to understand this woman who had been such a central figure in his life, and yet, in many ways, had remained a mystery to him. He shared his own memories of Patricia then, stories from his childhood that made the Queen smile despite her sadness. He reminded her of the time Patricia had taught him to sail at Broadlands, how patient she had been when he kept steering the boat in circles. He spoke of her wisdom, her gentle way of offering advice without judgment, her ability to see the best in people even when they struggled to see it in themselves. The Queen reached over and took her son's hand, a gesture so unexpected that Charles almost pulled away in surprise. But he caught himself, allowing his mother's small, gloved hand to rest in his. They stayed that way for several miles, connected in silence, united in their shared grief and their rediscovery of each other. When they arrived at the burial site, the official mourners had already departed. The fresh earth over Patricia's grave was covered in flowers, hundreds of them, sent by people whose lives she had touched. The security detail remained at a discreet distance, giving the Queen and Charles the privacy they needed. They stood together beside the grave, and the Queen finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then more freely, years of suppressed emotion finding release in this private moment. Charles put his arm around his mother's shoulders, holding her as she wept, offering the physical comfort that had been so absent from their relationship for so many years. The moment was transformative. The Queen, who had trained herself never to show such emotion, who had built walls of protocol and propriety around her true feelings, was finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. And Charles, who had often felt inadequate in his mother's eyes, was discovering that he could be exactly what she needed. Not a perfect heir, not a flawless prince, but simply a loving son. When the tears finally subsided, they stood together in silence, looking down at the grave of their friend. The Queen spoke to Patricia, words meant for her ears alone, sharing thoughts and feelings that she had never been able to express while her friend was alive. Charles remained quiet, respecting his mother's need to process her grief in her own way. After several long minutes, the Queen straightened, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief she pulled from her pocket. She looked at Charles with an expression of gratitude, and something else, something that might have been peace. They walked slowly back to the car, their steps synchronized, their bodies close together in a way that conveyed unity and mutual support. The autumn wind rustled the leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. Life was continuing, as it always did, but something fundamental had changed between the Queen and her eldest son. On the drive back to London, they talked more openly than they had in years. The Queen shared concerns she had about the future of the monarchy, about the challenges Charles would face when his time came to wear the crown. She spoke without her usual guardedness, allowing him to see her doubts and fears alongside her hopes and dreams for the institution she had served for so long. Charles, in turn, opened up about his own anxieties, his awareness of the criticism he faced, his determination to serve the nation in his own way when the time came. He assured his mother that he understood the weight of the responsibility that would one day be his, that he was preparing for it, even as he knew he could never truly be ready. The Queen listened to her son with new ears, hearing not just the words but the genuine commitment behind them. She realized that she had been so focused on Charles's shortcomings, so worried about whether he would be able to fill her shoes, that she had failed to see his strengths, his compassion, his deep concern for social issues, his willingness to use his platform to advocate for causes he believed in. They discussed Diana, Charles's first wife, whose death still cast a long shadow over the family. The Queen had not always understood Diana, had sometimes been frustrated by her inability to adapt to royal life in the way that had been expected. But she acknowledged now, to Charles, that she could have been more supportive, more understanding of the impossible situation Diana had found herself in. Charles appreciated his mother's honesty, her willingness to reflect on past mistakes. It helped him to know that even the Queen, with all her experience and wisdom, recognized that she had not always gotten things right. It made her more human, more approachable, more like the mother he had always wished for. They also spoke about William and Harry, the Queen's grandsons who would carry the royal family into the future. The Queen expressed her pride in both young men, her hope that they would continue to evolve the monarchy in ways that kept it relevant and meaningful to modern Britain. She asked Charles about their lives, their hopes, their challenges, showing a grandmotherly interest that she had not always been able to express when they were younger. As the car entered London again, weaving through traffic that had picked up since their morning departure, both the Queen and Charles felt different. The grief was still there, Patricia's absence still a painful reality, but it was accompanied now by something else, a sense of connection, of understanding, of family bonds that had been strengthened rather than strained by loss. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace, Charles helped his mother out of the car, his hand steady as she leaned on him. They stood for a moment in the palace courtyard, neither one quite ready to return to the formality and structure of their normal lives. The Queen looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw not just the heir to her throne, not just the prince who would someday be king, but the man he had become, flawed but sincere, complicated but compassionate, uncertain but dedicated. She saw someone worthy of respect and, more importantly, worthy of her love. The afternoon sun was filtering through the palace windows as the Queen settled into her private study. She had meetings scheduled, documents to review, the endless work of monarchy that never truly paused, even for grief. But for the first time in decades, she found her mind wandering from duty to personal reflection. The private secretary knocked gently before entering, carrying the daily briefing papers that required her attention. He noticed immediately that something was different about his monarch. There was a softness to her features, a relaxation in her posture that he had not seen in years. He wondered if the emotional release at Patricia's grave had brought her some measure of peace. The Queen worked through her papers with her usual efficiency, signing documents, making notes, preparing for the next day's engagements. But between tasks, her mind kept returning to the morning's journey with Charles, to the conversations they had shared, to the feeling of his arm around her shoulders as she wept. It had been so long since she had allowed anyone to see her that vulnerable, so long since she had accepted comfort instead of offering it. She thought about her own mother, the Queen Mother, who had died more than a decade earlier. Her mother had been a formidable woman, strong and dignified, but she had also known how to show warmth, how to connect with people on an emotional level in ways that Elizabeth had always struggled with. The Queen Mother had worried, in her final years, that Elizabeth had become too isolated, too trapped within the role she played. Perhaps her mother had been right. Perhaps in her determination to be the perfect monarch, Elizabeth had sacrificed too much of her humanity, built walls too high for even her own children to scale. But today, with Charles, those walls had crumbled, at least partially, and the Queen was surprised to find that the vulnerability did not weaken her. If anything, she felt stronger for having shared her grief, for having allowed her son to support her. Across London, Charles was engaged in his own afternoon activities, but his mind was equally preoccupied with the morning's events. He had seen a side of his mother that few people ever witnessed, and it had fundamentally changed his understanding of her. The distant, formal figure he had known all his life had revealed herself to be deeply feeling, capable of profound emotion, simply better at hiding it than most people. He realized that his mother's reserve had not been coldness, as he had sometimes interpreted it in his youth. It had been protection, a shield she had built to survive in a role that demanded everything from her. She had learned, from a very young age, that showing emotion was dangerous, that vulnerability could be exploited, that a monarch must always appear in control. But that control had come at cost. Charles understood now that his mother's apparent emotional distance had not been a rejection of him or his siblings, but rather a manifestation of the impossible position she had been thrust into at such a young age. She had been 25 when she became queen, still young, still learning who she was, suddenly responsible for an entire nation and a centuries-old institution. That evening, Charles made an unexpected decision. He called his brother Andrew and his sister and inviting them for a private dinner. He wanted to share with them what had happened that day, to encourage them to reach out to their mother in new ways, to help bridge the gaps that years of formality had created, and arrived first, practical, and no nonsense as always. She had been close to Patricia too, and the loss had hit her hard. She listened as Charles described the morning's visit to the grave, the conversations in the car, the Queen's tears, and was surprised but not entirely shocked. She had always suspected that their mother's feelings ran deeper than she allowed anyone to see. Andrew arrived shortly after, bringing with him the bravado that had always characterized his personality, but that had been tempered by his own recent struggles. He listened to Charles's story with unexpected attention, his face softening as he understood the significance of what their eldest brother was describing. The three siblings talked late into the evening, sharing memories of their childhood, discussing their complex relationships with their mother, acknowledging the ways in which the weight of the crown had affected all of them. They talked about how their mother had always seemed more comfortable with her role as queen than as a mother, how duty had always come first, how they had learned to accept her distance as normal even when it hurt. But Charles encouraged them to see things differently now. Their mother was aging, he reminded them. She would not be with them forever. Patricia's death had been a stark reminder of mortality, of the finite nature of even the most remarkable lives. If they wanted a real relationship with their mother, if they wanted to know her as a person rather than just as a monarch, they needed to make that effort while they still could, and agreed immediately, recognizing the wisdom in Charles's words. She had always been the most pragmatic of the siblings, and she understood that time was precious. Andrew was more hesitant, his relationship with the Queen having been strained by his own controversies and mistakes, but even he acknowledged that reaching out was worth the risk of rejection. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the Queen was having her own moment of reflection. She had invited her lady-in-waiting for tea, a woman who had served her for decades and who had become something of a confidant over the years. They sat in the Queen's private sitting room, surrounded by photographs of family members spanning generations, drinking tea from delicate china cups. The Queen talked about Charles, about the day they had shared, about her realization that she had not been as good a mother as she might have been. The lady-in-waiting listened with sympathy, but she gently pushed back against the Queen's self-criticism. She reminded Elizabeth of the impossible circumstances she had faced, of the expectations placed upon her, of the fact that she had done her best in a situation that would have broken most people. But the Queen was not interested in excuses. She was interested in change. She asked her lady-in-waiting for advice on how to build better relationships with her children, how to show them the affection she felt but had always struggled to express. It was a remarkable conversation, a powerful woman asking for help in navigating the most basic of human connections, family love. The lady-in-waiting suggested small changes. More phone calls that were not about official business. More private meals together, away from staff and formality. More expressions of interest in their lives, their concerns, their joys. Simple things, really, but things that the Queen had not prioritized in her decades-long focus on duty. That night before bed, the Queen did something she rarely did. She picked up the phone and called Charles directly, not through secretaries or staff, but person to person. When he answered, surprised to hear her voice, she simply told him that she had appreciated the day they had shared, that his support had meant more to her than she could properly express, and that she loved him. The words hung in the air between them, monumental in their simplicity. Charles felt tears prick his eyes as he heard his mother say those 3 words that she had spoken so rarely throughout his life. He told her he loved her too, his voice thick with emotion, and they talked for several more minutes about nothing and everything before finally saying goodnight. After hanging up, Charles sat in his study for a long time, staring at the phone as if it might disappear and take the conversation with it. His wife Camilla found him there, and when she asked what had happened, he told her about the call, about his mother's unprecedented openness, about the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Camilla smiled, understanding the significance of the moment. She had long encouraged Charles to find ways to connect with his mother, knowing that both of them would benefit from a closer relationship. She was glad that grief, painful as it was, had opened a door that had been closed for too long. The next few weeks saw subtle but important changes in the royal family's dynamics. The Queen made more of an effort to call her children, to ask about their lives beyond official duties, and came for tea more often, sharing stories about her charity work and her own children. Andrew, tentatively at first, began to rebuild bridges that his mistakes had damaged, finding his mother more willing to listen and less quick to judge than he had expected. But it was with Charles that the most profound change occurred. They began meeting regularly for private lunches, just the two of them, talking about everything from politics to gardening, from history to hopes for the future. The Queen shared stories from her long reign, lessons she had learned, mistakes she regretted. Charles listened and learned, but he also shared his own perspectives, his own vision for what the monarchy could be in a changing world. These conversations were not always easy. Sometimes old hurts surfaced, old disagreements flared up. But they worked through them together, committed to building something new and better from the foundation of shared grief and renewed understanding. The Queen began to see Charles not as a disappointing heir who would never measure up to her standards, but as a thoughtful, dedicated man who would bring his own strengths to the role when his time came. Charles, for his part, began to forgive his mother for the way she had failed him, recognizing that she had been doing her best in an impossible situation. He understood now that her emotional distance had not been personal, that it had been a survival mechanism for a woman thrust into overwhelming responsibility at a young age. This understanding allowed him to let go of resentment and embrace the relationship that was possible now. The media, always watching the royal family with intense scrutiny, noticed the changes. Photographs showed the Queen and Charles together more often, their body language more relaxed, their interactions more natural. Commentators speculated about what had caused this apparent warming of their relationship, with most attributing it to the Queen's advancing age and the natural passing of generational responsibilities. But those within the family knew the truth. It had been Patricia's funeral, that moment when Charles had reached out to comfort his grieving mother, that had catalyzed the change. Sometimes, the most profound transformations come from the simplest gestures, from one person seeing another's vulnerability and responding with love rather than judgment. 6 months after Patricia's funeral, the Queen sat in her private garden at Windsor Castle, enjoying the early spring sunshine. The flowers were beginning to bloom, daffodils and crocuses pushing through the earth in a riot of yellow and purple. Life, persistent and beautiful, was reasserting itself after the gray dormancy of winter. Charles was expected for lunch, something that had become a regular occurrence in recent months. The Queen found herself looking forward to these visits in a way she never had before. Her son had become not just a duty or a responsibility, but genuinely enjoyable company. They talked about books they had read, debates in Parliament, the challenges facing various charities they supported. But they also talked about ordinary things, the weather, the garden, memories of holidays long past. The Queen reflected on how much had changed since that day at Patricia's funeral. The moment when Charles had touched her arm, when he had stood beside her as she wept at the graveside, had opened something in both of them. It had broken down barriers that decades of protocol and formality had erected, allowing genuine affection to flow between mother and son in ways it never had before. She thought about all the years she had spent maintaining distance, convinced that showing emotion was weakness, that a monarch must always remain above the fray of human feeling. Patricia's death had taught her the cost of that isolation. Her friend had lived fully, loved openly, embraced both joy and sorrow with equal courage. In her final gift to the Queen, Patricia had shown her that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation of genuine human connection. When Charles arrived, he brought with him an energy that brightened the afternoon. He had news about a new environmental initiative he was launching, and his enthusiasm was contagious. The Queen listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, offering insights from her own decades of experience. This was how they connected now, through shared passion for service, through mutual respect for each other's perspectives. Over lunch, Charles mentioned that he had been going through old family photographs, preparing materials for an exhibition that would mark significant royal anniversaries. He had found pictures of the Queen as a young woman, before her coronation, when she was still Princess Elizabeth with her whole life stretching before her, not yet knowing the weight that would settle on her shoulders. The Queen asked to see some of these photographs, and Charles promised to bring them next time. But the conversation sparked memories, and the Queen found herself talking about her youth in ways she rarely did. She spoke of falling in love with Philip, of the happiness she had felt despite knowing that her life would never be entirely her own. She talked about the early years of her marriage, before she became queen, when she and Philip had lived in Malta, and she had tasted something close to ordinary life. Charles listened with fascination. He had heard some of these stories before, but never told with such emotional honesty, never with his mother's guard so fully lowered. He asked questions, drawing out details, helping his mother remember and relive moments that had been buried under decades of duty and responsibility. They talked about his father, Prince Philip, who had become increasingly frail in recent years. The Queen spoke with tenderness about her husband, acknowledging both his strengths and his flaws, the ways he had supported her, and the ways his own frustrations with royal life had sometimes made things harder. It was a complex portrait, honest and three-dimensional, the kind of sharing that only happened when people truly trusted each other. Charles shared his own memories of his father, the complicated relationship they had navigated, the ways Philip's expectations had both pushed him to excel and sometimes made him feel inadequate. The Queen listened with new understanding, recognizing patterns she had not seen before, understanding how her own distance had been compounded by Philip's stern approach to parenting. As the afternoon wore on, they walked together through the castle gardens, the Queen moving more slowly than she once had, but still steady on her feet. Charles matched her pace, his hand occasionally at her elbow when the path was uneven, a gesture of support that had become natural between them. They talked about William and Harry, the Queen's grandsons who were navigating their own paths through royal life. The Queen expressed concern about Harry, who had always seemed less comfortable with the constraints of his role, who chafed against the expectations and protocols. Charles shared his own conversations with his younger son, his attempts to help Harry find a way to serve that felt authentic to him while still honoring his responsibilities. The Queen appreciated Charles's approach, the way he tried to understand rather than simply dictate, the way he acknowledged the genuine difficulties of royal life rather than dismissing them. She recognized that this was something she had not always done with her own children, and she told Charles so, acknowledging her own failures as a parent with a humility that would have been impossible for her just a year earlier. Charles assured his mother that he did not blame her, that he understood the impossible position she had been in, that he was grateful for all she had taught him about duty and service. But he also thanked her for changing, for opening up, for allowing their relationship to evolve into something richer and more meaningful than it had been for most of his life. As evening approached, and Charles prepared to leave, the Queen did something that surprised both of them. She reached up and kissed her son on the cheek, a spontaneous gesture of affection that broke through the remaining vestiges of formality between them. Charles was stunned for a moment, then wrapped his arms around his mother in a careful embrace, mindful of her age and frailty, but unable to resist the impulse to hold her close. It was this embrace, not the kiss at the funeral, that had never actually happened in quite the way the media imagined, that represented the true transformation of their relationship. Two people who had spent decades maintaining careful distance were finally allowing themselves to love each other openly, to express the affection that had always existed but had been buried under layers of protocol and duty. After Charles left, the Queen sat alone in her study, watching the sun set over the Windsor grounds. She thought about Patricia, about the friend she had lost, about the gift that loss had ultimately given her. Grief had stripped away her defenses, had made her vulnerable enough to let her son in, had shown her that strength could coexist with tenderness, that a queen could also be a mother. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter to Patricia's daughter, something she had been meaning to do for months. In it, she expressed not just condolences but gratitude, thanking Patricia for her friendship, for her understanding, for her example of how to live with both grace and authenticity. She wrote about how Patricia's death had changed her, had opened her eyes to what truly mattered, had helped her reconnect with her son in ways that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. In the weeks and months that followed, the Queen's health began to decline, the inevitable consequence of her advanced age. But she faced this with surprising equanimity, no longer clinging to control with quite the same fierce determination. She began to let go gradually, allowing Charles to take on more responsibilities, trusting him in ways she had struggled to before Patricia's funeral. Charles rose to these challenges with a confidence born partly from his own growth and partly from his mother's newfound faith in him. He made mistakes, as everyone does, but he learned from them. He brought his own vision and values to the role, modernizing some aspects while preserving the core traditions that gave the monarchy meaning. The relationship between mother and son continued to deepen as the Queen's final years progressed. They talked regularly, not just about official business, but about life, about fears and hopes, about regrets and dreams. The Queen shared wisdom accumulated over decades, while Charles offered fresh perspectives that sometimes challenged his mother's assumptions, but always with respect and love. When the Queen finally passed away, years after Patricia's funeral, Charles was at her bedside, holding her hand. In those final moments, she looked at him with eyes that held both sadness at leaving and peace at knowing she had done her best. She told him she was proud of him, that she trusted him to carry forward the legacy she had built while also making it his own. She told him, one final time, that she loved him. Charles wept as his mother died, but his tears were not just of grief. They were also of gratitude for the years of closeness they had shared after Patricia's funeral, for the conversations and connections that had transformed their relationship, for the mother he had finally gotten to know beneath the crown. At the Queen's funeral, watched by billions around the world, Charles stood with dignity and sorrow, honoring his mother as both a monarch and as the woman who had given him life. He thought about that day at Patricia's funeral, about the moment when he had reached out to comfort her, about how that simple gesture had opened a door that had remained closed for too long. In his first speech as king, Charles spoke eloquently about duty and service, about the weight of the crown and the privilege of serving the nation. But he also spoke, briefly but meaningfully, about the importance of connection, of family, of not allowing the demands of position to completely overshadow the need for human warmth and love. Those who knew the family history understood that he was speaking from personal experience, from lessons learned through years of distance, followed by a precious period of closeness. The photograph from Patricia's funeral, the one showing Charles's hand on his mother's arm, took on new significance in the years that followed. It became symbolic not just of one moment, but of a transformation, a healing, a bridge built between generations. It reminded people that even the most formal, most distant relationships could change, that it was never too late to reach out, to connect, to love. In the end, Patricia's greatest legacy to the royal family was not her decades of service or her remarkable resilience in the face of tragedy. It was the gift she gave in her death, the catalyst she provided for Charles and his mother to finally, truly see each other. Sometimes, it takes loss to remind us what we have, to show us what matters most, to give us the courage to break down the walls we have built around our hearts. The Queen had learned this lesson, and she had passed it on to her son. Charles, as king, carried this understanding forward, working to create a monarchy that balanced tradition with humanity, duty with warmth, service with genuine connection. It was perhaps the most important thing his mother had taught him, the final gift of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to be both a queen and a human being. And so Patricia's funeral, initially just another sad farewell in a series of losses, became a turning point, a moment when grief opened a door that formality had kept locked. It was a reminder that sometimes our greatest growth comes from our deepest pain, that vulnerability can be a strength rather than a weakness, and that it is never too late to tell the people we love how much they mean to us. The kiss that the world imagined, the gesture of comfort at the funeral, became in its way real through all the smaller gestures that followed. The phone calls, the lunches, the walks in the garden, the conversations that bridged decades of distance. Charles and his mother had found their way back to each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that the crown did not have to separate them from their humanity. They could be both royals and family, both servants of the nation and people who loved each other deeply and without reservation. This was Patricia's final gift, her lasting legacy to the family she had loved and served for so long. And in the quiet moments when Charles thought of his mother, when he missed her presence and sought her guidance, he remembered that day at the funeral, the beginning of their journey back to each other. And he was grateful. Grateful for the grief that had broken down walls. Grateful for the time they had been given. Grateful for the love that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged and embraced.